Bad history. Bad history does not make a bad movie. As historians, you should know the difference, but you can still enjoy them. The question is, why is the history bad? Is it because the filmmakers were lazy and hoped no one would notice? Is it meant to be funny? Is it satire? Did the filmmakers have a political or social agenda? Are they promoting a particular point of view? Or did they just have bad writers? There are all sorts of bad history in popular culture, and we'll go through them one by one. But first I want to say that we're not worried about flubs in this context. A flub is a small accidental error, like accidentally showing a Starbucks cup. We're not searching for small mistakes in otherwise well-told stories. In this section, you should be looking for larger themes that are off base enough to compromise the historical accuracy of the whole book or film. Inaccuracy. It's something that fundamentally represents stories or facts. If you spot an error, ask how significant is it to the underlying truth. Did they put the battle at the wrong time of day? That's probably not important. Did they put the battle at the wrong time of year? Depicting the Battle of Stalingrad happening in the summertime would be a major misrepresentation, since freezing and starving were major factors for both sides. So, just to correct a little bad history, Americans did not capture the Enigma machine. Leonardo da Vinci is not part of a conspiracy, and Anastasia Romanoff did not survive the assassination. The film U-571 infuriated the British because they really did capture the device that allowed the Allies to break the Nazi code. The Da Vinci Code was never meant to be read as history. There have been dozens of books and TV shows debunking or promoting it, but Dan Brown wrote it as fiction and was really amazed that people believed it. There was a woman in the 1950s who claimed to be Princess Anastasia, and some people believed it. But DNA has since proved that she was a fraud. Anachronism deals with time period details. You see this mostly in costume, technology, and culture. Often, it's a minor mistake, just a flub. But if it bothers you enough to distract from the story, it's a problem. Different anachronisms bother different people. The fact that the costumes of the Pride and Prejudice on the left are 100 years off base, while the ones on the right are perfect, does not fundamentally change the story, but it drives me nuts. Of course, many people can love both versions of the story and never notice the mistake. On the other hand, mistakes in weapons or automobiles would likely go unnoticed by me, but could ruin the story for someone who knows and cares about those things. Attitudes and culture can be anachronistic as well. This is a World War II film, Kelly's Heroes, was made in the 1970s, so this spaced-out hippie character is funny, but not accurate to the 1940s. This represents not only anachronistic vocabulary, but also attitude and worldview. Is it a problem? Well, it's a fun heist movie, not really purporting to be true or historical, but it distracts me from the story and causes me to take note when I should be involved in the story. The anachronisms in The Wild Wild West and Marie Antoinette are less of a problem because they are an intentional and integral part of the film's style. Accuracy in comedy is also judged more loosely. The Onion is a satire magazine. If you don't know that, you might not get the joke, or believe the news is real. When this story ran several decades ago, Chinese news agencies reported it as true and cited The Onion as their source, which in turn made news in the U.S. You may also be familiar with the Babylon Bee. If you're a church-going Christian, you're going to get the joke. If not, you're likely to believe the stories are true. So, just to set the record straight again, no one should be getting their news from Saturday Night Live. Spinal Tap was not a real band, although they did go on tour after they pretended to be one and people loved it. And teenage dog walkers did not really break the Watergate case. In the case of overt comedy, people are expected to know the difference. Alternate. Alternate history poses the question, what if things had happened differently? This is especially popular in novels. What if? What if the South had won the Civil War? What if the Nazis won World War II? Again, you are not supposed to view this as actual history, but it can be very interesting if they use good facts as a starting point. Time travel is a favorite genre that can involve actual historical events. The things that makes time travel stories interesting to historians is the butterfly effect. The fact that a small change in one person's story can have a chain reaction and a huge impact on other seemingly unrelated events. It really makes you think about how all history is interwoven. Another twist on time travel stories is a parallel universe concept, which is also related to alternate history. It imagines that history can be split into two different what-if storylines that are not mutually exclusive. Star Trek fans will know what I'm talking about. So far, the bad history we've been covering is pretty innocuous, or even interesting and entertaining. But revisionist history can create real problems for understanding the past. Revisionist history involves rewriting history through reinterpretation. This is an important job of historians, but it's also the mission of many people who have an agenda to rewrite history to reflect their politics, identity, or beliefs. Here's a good example. Reanalyzing historical evidence for a greater understanding. This can be valuable, looking back in hindsight with a fuller perspective because we need to revise our thinking when new facts come to light. The relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' story was long denied as slander and gossip until it was proved fairly recently. Now the relationship is considered an important element in understanding Thomas Jefferson. Another example. Were Native Americans really savages who needed to be eliminated for the sake of civilized people? There is good reason to adjust the attitudes held 100 or 200 years ago. But there are many more bad examples. It can be destructive to truth and understanding when we try to lay our current interests and priorities on top of history to twist into something it never was. Inserting current politics, attitudes, social mores, and social philosophies where they didn't exist distorts history. Rewriting history to support a current political social goal may work in the short term, but it has little lasting value. Take Christopher Columbus as an example. Is he a hero or a villain? One aspect of history and popular culture is public commemorations such as the holidays. We don't mark the calendar to celebrate every historic anniversary. How and why we choose to do those that we do, should we even have a holiday for Columbus? On the pro side, Columbus bravely discovered America, brought new wealth to Europeans, civilized and Christianized savage people, and changed the course of Western culture, and gave us our land. This is why we celebrate Columbus Day. On the con side, discovering North America was an accident. He was trying to get rich, didn't discover anything because the people already living here knew all about North America. European intrusion brought disease, death, and oppression to two continents, which is why some people want to ditch Columbus and celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day instead. Historians have a lot to work with here, with all the mixed motivations, unintended consequences, and multiple countries, cultures, the church, business interests, plus science that was a mystery to everyone 500 years ago. It's not fair to either credit or blame Columbus for the course of history and the march of time. So rewriting history to set things right, according to contemporary attitudes, culture, and politics, is a dangerous game. What about statues and monuments? Should monuments and place names be permanent to reflect history, or should they change as taste and opinions change? Some view it as removing offensive materials. Others consider it erasing history. Most current monument controversies are concentrated on the Civil War and racism. Many people believe that we should not have public monuments or even streets or buildings named after Civil War Confederates or slaveholders. Nathan Bedford Forrest was definitely a racist. But you know who else held racist and sexist ideas? nearly every American until the mid-20th century. Woodrow Wilson was a racist. Should the name of my elementary school, Wilson Elementary in Cincinnati, Ohio, be changed? If you take down every statue and rename every building named for someone who oppressed women, blacks, homosexuals, or Native Americans, or just expressed ideas that are outdated, we would have to rename most of the schools and public buildings in America. On the other hand, the public monuments do reflect our shared values as a society. And if those values change, shouldn't we have the power to change our environment as well, to reflect that? It's a philosophical challenge that relies heavily on our shared attitudes towards history. In other parts of the world, whole cities and nations have changed names. In the case of the Soviet Union, the totalitarian regime changed place names as part of a psychological campaign to control social identity. In other parts of the world, place names have reverted to the original years after colonial rule in order to restore cultural identity. Interestingly, Leningrad reverted to being called St. Petersburg after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now that Russia is once again ruled by a dictator, will Putin change the name again? It could happen. Names are symbols that are rooted in a larger power and identity politics. Whether you call a country Burma or Myanmar depends on your political stance on the current government. On a smaller scale, identity politics can seep into our popular culture as well. The following are a few examples of things to look for when doing your research. Homosexuality. Of course, there are legitimate examples of homosexual figures in history and of different historical cultural attitudes towards sexuality depending on the time and place, such as in ancient Greece. It's a legitimate practice to revise history if that information has been suppressed in deference to 18th, 19th, or 20th century Western ideals. But there is plenty of evidence, legitimate biographical study on Da Vinci to suggest that he was a homosexual. However, there's also a movement in popular revisionist history that wants to out all sorts of historical figures who were not gay to support a political or social agenda. Abraham Lincoln was outed as gay a few years back by a historian who misconstrued 19th century customs to support his theory. It made a lot of news and made the historian famous for a minute, but the proposition fell apart under closer scrutiny. Do a little research, and you can find claims that Obama, Clinton, and pretty much every other controversial figure is gay or at least a sexual deviant. Outing people who were really black, as if historians have conspired to hide that fact, is also an issue. People who want to correlate Cleopatra or other ancient Egyptians to a West African or Central African ethnicity want to link them to a culture that they simply did not share, for purposes of enhancing the prestige of black, mostly American black, culture. Actual historians recognize that African culture is as rich and diverse enough to stand out on its own as any field of study without claiming something more famous as its own. On the other hand, Western culture is moving towards understanding that Jesus, a Middle Eastern Jew, was not a pale, blonde, blue-eyed man. That is also revisionist history, because it is revising long-held historical understanding. Race in history is an issue that is very heated right now, not just in academics, but in the popular realm as well. Feminism. As the legitimate reanalysis of the role of women in history gains traction, so too does the inappropriate insertion of 20th century Western feminism into the lives of female historical figures. Jane Austen was not a feminist. Her novels reflect English middle-class values in 1800. Although she is very witty in observing how the system worked, she was not trying to change society or women's roles in it. In fact, female characters in her novels who did not display the expected traits of demure modesty and follow accepted social conventions are depicted by the author very badly. Still, Hollywood keeps making anachronistic adaptations in which her heroines are outspoken rebels, flouting convention. These are not Jane Austen characters, but those of modern screenwriters inserting their own contemporary values. Revisionist history tends to want to take every important woman in every time period and culture and paint her with the same brush. We already talked about the changing attitudes towards Native Americans in earlier lessons. While at one time they were all portrayed as interchangeable savages, popular culture swung all the way to the other side and adopted the notion that indigenous people of North America were all blissed-out, peace-loving nature freaks until the Europeans showed up. This is common in countries with a colonial history. It is easier to justify moving in and taking over if the natives are lesser people, savage, simple, or less than human. Then, post-colonialism, there is a swing in the other direction to make the original inhabitants mythic, noble, and superior victims of a hostile takeover. Of course, the reality is as complex as any historical meeting of cultures and the struggle for opportunity, freedom, power, and property among them. Popular culture always leans towards simplification and the good guy, bad guy divide. But history is in danger of being literally rewritten. The Texas textbook battle comes up every few years because the state of Texas buys so many textbooks that it affects the content of educational materials sold around the nation. The Texas Textbook Committee is mainly comprised of political appointees, not educators, historians, or scientists. This causes national controversy because the committee is outspoken in its desire to have the material reflect a white, conservative Christian worldview and leave out anything that goes against their politics. Deniers create even more confusion, claiming that historical events never happened. There are literally hundreds of thousands of people around the world right now who are being taught that the Holocaust never happened. In Turkey, it is illegal to even mention the Armenian genocide. After initially taking responsibility for its actions during World War II, the Japanese are now experiencing a cultural shift whereby they are once again considering themselves victims of aggression rather than the perpetrators. Popular American attitudes towards Russia have changed drastically in my lifetime. In my childhood and teens, Russia was the evil empire, a great threat to the United States and other free nations. Proxy wars were fought in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan over opposing ideologies. But attitudes about Russia being the single biggest threat to the well-being of the U.S. have changed radically in my lifetime, and many young people today view the Cold War as alarmist propaganda. This seems not so much denial as disinterest, but those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. For their part, the Soviets were the original masters of disinformation. These pictures show how original Soviet officials were slowly erased from official portraits and textbooks until only Stalin remained. Citizens living in dictatorships have long been subject to learning only the official falsified story. But now everyone all over the world is challenged with deep fake videos, fake news, social media disinformation, and official denials. This provides a challenge not only to the average citizen, but to the historian as well. How will future historians be able to find reliable primary sources when researching this area of high-tech disinformation? It will be up to you, the 21st century historian, to sort this mess out and set the record straight.